This is the Fix Your Sciatica podcast.
So let's talk about Pilates. A fair amount of the patients and clients that I work with often ask me when they get better, Ashley, is Pilates a good way for me to get back into physical activity? Or I have some active patients who are saying, Ashley, is Pilates just safe activity for me to do when I'm dealing with sciatica and low back pain? And my general response is, yes, I'm actually a huge fan of Pilates. I think it actually provides a ton of value into a person's life. But that's pretty much the end of my statement because I'm not a Pilates practitioner myself. I've met a fair amount of Pilates practitioners and they do a fantastic job. So I did a little diving, but luckily today's guest was quite serendipitous. They reached out to me and I said, I've been meaning to interview someone about Pilates and the method itself. So today I have Charlene, the founder of CoreSpring, which we're going to get into, and is a Pilates professional. So Charlene, it's great to meet you and thank you so much for being on today's episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. And I want to start by saying I love the name of your podcast because this is such a needed, just state it, just say it. I fix sciatica because so many people suffer from it. They often don't know what it is and they don't know the cause. They go to Dr. Google. It's very confusing and they really can't move comfortably. So finding movement solutions is important because they need it. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome, and it's really an honor. And we'll say, as of this recording, we are about 3 years into the podcast, and we're really going strong because of people like you and the questions that we come across through our lives. And it's something that I do plan on continuing on for the very long future. And so we're going to continue to really address this because it's such a confusing thing when you're dealing with pain. It is a part of our life which is necessary. The pain that we deal with is a way to protect ourselves. But when you're in pain for a long period of time, there's something that needs to be addressed. And many times all we're thinking of is how can we actually get into our life again, right? And so looking into Pilates, I'm really excited to take a deep dive into the method. I know that we're going to be able to get some really amazing meat and potatoes through this. Now, before we get into that, for the listeners who haven't quite met you or know you yet, tell us a little bit more about your background and how you got into the work that you're doing now.
Well, I am the accidental Pilates master teacher, really. I discovered early in my life that movement helped me with pain in my back from scoliosis. I was not diagnosed with scoliosis as a child. I think what happened was my spine was impacted by some things that happened during my childhood. And then by the time I was in my 20s, I was actually diagnosed with scoliosis. And so it explained, now I've got the diagnosis of why I've been in pain. But by the time I was about 11 or 12, I realized that movement helped me from swimming because I had to swim before I could walk growing up in California, in LA. And but when you can't find a pool, what do you do? If movement helps you feel better. I did not set out to create something. I didn't set out to become a fitness person whatsoever. I wanted to be a stage actress, and I ultimately became a stage actress. I wanted to be a psychologist. I did not become a psychologist. I have a degree in psychology. I have a master's degree in theater and film. I studied at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. So I found that the want and the need to study theater actually forced me to really look at my body shape, my levels of pain, and how I was going to play these characters if I had a hump on my back, because I had a hump of muscle, and slouchy posture, and it just wasn't going to work. So I had to fix it. So I started with some yoga stretches and some things in my room and some books from my mom's bookshelf. I mean, we're in Los Angeles, they're everywhere. And I just did it quietly. I never talked to anybody about it. If I mentioned pain on the playground, the other kids looked at me like, what do you mean? What do you mean your back hurts? What's wrong with you? So I associated a lot with pain that you don't talk about it because people get either frightened or bullied about pain. So I just kept it to myself and went about my business. So I started with that, and then that made me a collector of books about exercise. So I had quite a library by the time I went to college and in college and beyond. I was always looking for books about exercise because I like to work privately by myself in my room. And I found that I felt better and better and better. And I started to challenge myself with ballet classes and actually going to some yoga classes and things like that. But it was when I was in France in my 20s that I discovered a book called Return to Life by Joseph Pilates in an English-speaking bookstore. in the back, covered with dust. And I opened this book and then started to do the exercises and found them to be extremely effective. I really fell in love with them. But I couldn't find Pilates anywhere. There was nothing going on. We're talking about the mid 80s. So while I was there, I was very interested in dance. I started writing a dance column for an English speaking newspaper, interviewed a dancer. She said, "Oh, I have to go because I have to go to my plie session." And I said, "What's a plie? What's plie?" And she said, "Oh, it's this machine and I work with this woman and I have to heal my calf muscle that I damaged." I said, "Can I come along?" So the teacher let me in. I went into this room with this rickety, what I now know to be a reformer. She basically yelled and screamed at this woman for about an hour, and she was moving and sweating. And I was like, what is this thing? It had springs, and this woman was very like a ballet teacher. It was a former ballet teacher who became a Pilates teacher, which is the legacy of Pilates. Let me know if I'm going too fast because I'm trying to get a lot in. So that sort of, the machine, the word Pilates never came up. Mr. Pilates, nothing. Just plie and this woman. My book, and that the two sort of happened simultaneously. It wasn't until I came back to the States much later that I saw Pilates. And I went, oh, that's Mr. Pilates. I went, there were the machines. So I made the connection and started to look at ways that I could train with it. It was very expensive. It was all one-to-one pretty much at the time. There were a few reformer classes at the time, but not too many. There were very few. There were probably 4 Pilates studios in all of LA County at this time. But I did eventually find training, and I secretly wanted to become a teacher because I was working as a translator from French to English because I lived in Europe for 4 years. And I didn't want to be a translator because I was too much of a people person. So I'm a sort of an introvert extrovert. I can sit in front of a computer and write and translate all day, but I really need people. I need to get out there, and I'm a natural teacher. That's what I do. So I secretly wanted to do this training in Pilates. So of course I eventually did. And my friends were like, wait, you're a Pilates teacher? Because I do a lot of things under the hood. And then all of a sudden I come out sort of fully formed. So that's how I became a Pilates teacher. It was because it did so much for me. It was the thing that actually made everything else better. And I'll give you the best example. I was doing yoga, obviously, and some other things. I committed to doing Pilates, I think for a summer, maybe a little bit longer than that, to the exclusion of everything else. And when I went back to yoga, my favorite Saturday class here in Los Angeles, I went into tree pose on my left leg, and I fully expected to fall over when I was balancing on my right, and I didn't. I came straight up into tree pose with total control. When Mr. Pilates, who created the Pilates method, was born in 1883, he had rickets, he had asthma, he had a lot of challenges, physical challenges throughout his life. He created the Pilates method as a way to heal the body and build intense fitness. And this is important. This is an important fact to know, given what's happening with Pilates right now in the class format that we're looking at. Long story short, that really got my attention because I realized I was healing in a way that I had not before, that I had balance, that I had symmetry. And I started to actually dig a little bit deeper, reread his book, Return to Life. Because he was German, he developed his method in the United States between 2 world wars where Germans weren't really that popular. So there's not a lot of film footage of him speaking, but he documented his method in film and photograph, which is very expensive at the time because he felt it was so important to have the visuals. So we're lucky to have that. His books were ghost written, so they're dated, but the information is solid in terms of what he knew about the body at that time, which was a lot. So that prompted me to think maybe I'll become a yoga teacher and use Pilates to teach yoga. Because I knew I wanted to teach a form of new movement because of what it had done for me. When you're in pain, your personality is different. Your personality changes. I had been in pain for so much of my life that when I was starting to get out of pain in my 20s and into my early 30s, I was like, I feel like a different person. I have to tell everybody about this. And I assumed everybody was in pain, which is actually true. Which is actually true to a certain extent. Everybody has something. So I came into Pilates with Alexander technique, Feldenkrais, Heller work, Rolfing. All of these things I studied as yoga along the way. So when Pilates came along, it was just one of the many esoteric things that I was studying. Who knew that it would become explosively popular and it would happen to be my favorite? And I happened to become a Pilates teacher in the 90s, teaching movement for actors and teaching people how to get out of pain through the very simple movements that are built into the mat work. And then, of course, the machines. The machines always intrigued me. They're spring-loaded. They don't use weights. That got my attention because if Mr. Pilates had 60 years to think about this and to tinker, why was he tinkering with springs? So the the spring aspect of those machines always made me very curious. I've never been bored of Pilates, ever. And there are multiple machines. And so Pilates, he wrote a book in 1934 called To Your Health. He wrote Return to Life in 1945. Those were the only two books that he wrote. In his lifetime, he only certified two people, an African-American woman named Kathy Grant and a woman from Puerto Rico named Lolita San Miguel. In 1964, I just want to add that he was really at the cutting edge in the dance community, in the physiotherapy community, which is now physical therapy. He was smart enough to put his studio into the building where the New York City Ballet and George Balanchine and Martha Graham did their rehearsals. He was also a few blocks away from Madison Square Garden because he loved to work with men. So Pilates was never developed just for women at all. It was developed to be a rigorous training of the body that's based in the Greek Spartan mindset for mental fortitude. He was very much about you condition your body, you get a mind that is strong. That is just how it's going to be. If you're doing a mindless workout, you will get a mindless body. So there's an intelligence built in to his method, which is a synthesis. His father was a gymnastics teacher and had a gymnastics studio when he was growing up, and he was expected to learn these gymnastics routines, which were sort of hard on him. So he studied yoga, the Spartans. He was also encouraged to study combat. So there's a lot of footwork and sword fighting aspects to Pilates, a lot of dance. But when you get to an intermediate advanced level in Pilates, you feel like a combination of a dancer and a gymnast, which was an amazing gift to me as someone who was the last person picked on the teams because I was not that coordinated because my spine was off. So I had this lifetime of my grandmother saying, "You're not the most graceful kid in town," and things like that, to feeling this incredible, empowering strength, mind and body from Pilates. And then, of course, your spirit is free to practice whatever you want. In Pilates, we do not ascribe to chakras. We don't ascribe to any particular spiritual practice like a legitimate yoga practice probably would. But regardless, it helps. It helped my yoga. It helped my walking. I've created water programs with Pilates. And I've created CoreSpring, which is my company now, because CoreSpring is a spring apparatus that's handheld that you can use anywhere, including the water. And it helps to create a direct relationship with the spring, which of course was so much fun. After a lifetime of obsessing with why Joseph Pilates used springs, when I took the CoreSpring into my hands, when I first created it with my partner, a business partner and my patent partner, because we have patented this device, was, wow, this is what the spring feels like directly. And so that created the method, which I've been developing through COVID. I had to close my studio. There you go. And I developed CoreSpring and developed a method including direct spring resistance that now makes all the springs on the Pilates apparatus more accessible. And this is why I'm so excited about it and to share it with the world and Pilates teachers. You may never want to walk into a Pilates class, a yoga class, or a dance class, but you can probably do a CoreSpring class, and it will enhance all the things that you're doing. But when you get on those spring apparatus, after you've been using CoreSpring and direct spring resistance, it's a different experience. So that's my background, and that's how that happened.
Wow, what an amazing evolution of all this, and I really appreciate you sharing. Before we go into a couple more questions specific about like relating like Pilates to like sciatica and low back pain, you brought up some really interesting points or we'll call them milestones within your story. And I think one of the most so we'll bring up this concept of scoliosis. And I think what's interesting when it comes to scoliosis, and we look at it as like, okay, you as a child were dealing with pain for such a long period of time to the point where in your 20s you finally got diagnosed with scoliosis. And oftentimes patients who come to me, they're often being told like you have a scoliosis, you have an adult onset scoliosis, or like, I find what's interesting is the fact that you can have someone who has a scoliosis like yours, and maybe to the untrained eye, you can't see it, but it's there. There's some sort of asymmetry or rotation or shift. And the question is, why are you in so much pain? But then you look at the 80-year-old person walking through the streets of San Francisco and they are keeled on over and they have a big smile on their face. Like, how are they like operating with this? And one of the things that I learned, especially throughout my training and experience, is the fact that our posture and our asymmetries aren't really an issue until they become an issue. And so when you're in an active state of pain, that tells us that something needs to be adjusted or shifted. And then we look at the components, like what is happening in your body. Okay, you have a scoliosis. Let's see if that scoliosis is related to that. Which then brings up to the second part is, you were dealing with this pain for such a long period of time. And now that I am the father of a little girl, I just think about and especially my experience with work in the pediatrics world, where the pains that children experience, we're often saying, oh, well, they're just children, so they need to learn how to experience this pain. It's just a normal part of the process. And in a way, pain is a normal reaction. It's important. It protects us from danger. But I think it's important for parents and even the medical communities to not discredit the pain that our children are experiencing, because they can go decades of living in this pain where all of a sudden when they finally get this release, like Charlene went through, they're a completely different person. And so I think it is important for us to really not forget that although pain is a normal response, we can't just attribute the pain that these kids are experiencing to just typical growing pains. Yeah.
I didn't even have the word pain in my vocabulary. I didn't know how to describe what I was feeling.
Yeah. And I think
It hurt.
I realized I was discussing with another patient of mine who has been dealing with a lot of chronic pain, and that they were a retired physician. And we were just discussing what are the qualities of patient that we find that helps us do our jobs a little bit better. And I realized that for me, if you can describe how you feel, even if you can't use the word pain, if you can describe how you feel, it gives me an opportunity to do my job a little bit better. But oftentimes I find, well, one, everyone has the capacity to describe the pain that they're dealing with, like in any sort of terms. I think the challenge is that oftentimes patients and people aren't given the opportunity to share their pain, because either the doctor that they're working with only gives them 7 minutes of their day, or they're working with a physical therapist who says, okay, well, you have sciatica pain. Well, I'm just going to bulldoze you with these different exercises. But it is important for professionals, even like yourself, to be able to say, like, let's take a step back. Let's listen to what you're dealing with. Let's get a story. And then from there, we can get an idea. And and I really appreciate you starting off in like the performing arts world, because it's human expression, right? And human expression is a story. And we use our bodies, our movement as a way to tell a story. And we do the same thing with words and even just how we move in regards to the pain that we're feeling. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Congratulations on your daughter, by the way.
Thank you.
You brought up a couple of interesting points. And by the way, the name of my Pilates studio, when I founded it in 2007, it was in a playhouse, a small theater building in South Pasadena, where I had actually done a play years earlier. And it is called, because I still have this business, Playhouse Pilates, Body Smarts, and Performing Arts. And that is because I believe in human expression. If people want to work, if they want to create, I want them to be able to do it for a lifetime. This idea that we have to stagger to the finish line for 10 years in complete chaos, physically and emotionally and mentally, is absolutely against everything I believe in. Having grown up in a time when people didn't do that as much, so seeing this evolve as an adult, as a given, that you're just supposed to give up and lie down for the last 10 years of your life? No, that's part of my long game, if you will. But you brought up another point. People have different perceptions of pain. And this is something that one of the questions that you asked me that were telling me you were going to talk about today, I really thought about this, because a person's perception of pain is often inarticulatable. They cannot explain it, and they have an agenda, to get fit. They want to be fit. They see the picture. They see that they want that body. So I was that person. And I'm never very far from that person in my mind, because I work with clients every day who come in, and I'm able to talk to them in a way that their doctor can't. And this goes to your point we were talking about, I think, before we went live. Doctors often didn't recommend Pilates because it wasn't known. And nowadays they've actually tried it themselves. And so they understand it better. I was fortunate enough 20 years ago that I had doctors I'd never met sending them specifically to me for patients to prepare for surgeries for cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer. And they'd say, Dr. So-and-so recommended me. And I was like, I don't know this doctor. And I called this doctor and thanked her. And it's just because one of my clients had done prehab on her own dime, because they don't cover that by insurance, even today, which is shocking to me in some ways. But there's this idea of how does one communicate? So doctors don't want the liability unless it's a known commodity. They don't want the liability of saying, go try it. And then they say, oh, my doctor said to try it and I hurt myself. So I understand that. And it took a long time, being an early adapter of Pilates, to deal with the fact that people were not recommending this because they were afraid, that they didn't know what these machines were. They didn't know who I was. What is a Pilates teacher? A lot of those things have been established. But you said this about pain and levels of pain and perception of pain. I do marvel at older people who are just the people you're talking about in their 70s, 80s, 90s. My oldest client just turned 100. They have a different mindset about pain. They have more of the mindset that I had and was raised with. You don't talk about it. And of course it's bothering me. But then some people don't. Some people will come in, dancers will come in, and their feet are absolutely mangled from toe and all that stuff, and they don't feel anything in their feet. And I say, well, just in case you ever do, these are the things you can do to prepare your foot. So as a Pilates teacher, because of the condition of my spine, and by the way, I will say, I do not have any recognizable scoliosis in my back today. If you look at an x-ray of my back, there is no scoliosis whatsoever. If I get tired, I can feel where my S curve was. I can see that it's still weak, which goes to the point you said about children, is that I had that as a child and it was painful. I have that as an adult and it's not painful, meaning that sort of pre-scoliosis, if you will, that pre-anomaly in the spine that actually starts to create. So scoliosis, like a lot of things, is a movement issue. It's created by a pattern of movements. We are, and this is my original quote as far as I know, we are asymmetrical bipeds. The right side literally doesn't know what the left side is doing. We are vertical. We are intended to be vertical. The position of our pelvis, everything about us is supposed to be vertical. How do we achieve this effortlessly? And that's something that the Alexander Technique people are obsessed with, and that's why it greatly impacts how I teach Pilates. It's about how you orient the head weight in relationship to the core. So when I'm talking to people, what I started to realize about Pilates in particular, because you are learning some very complex concepts and principles of movement. You're not just saying, lift your head and do 20 of those, right? It's very different. You're actually instructing someone on how to use their body. And I found that the language that was coming down through the generations in Pilates even was dividing, because right and left brain don't really communicate. They have touch points in our brain. So language and movement and three-dimensional movement perception happen in different parts of your brain. But we need language to teach people to move. We need language to understand how people are feeling. We need language to communicate them what they should be feeling. So I did develop a method of teaching Pilates that involved, because some of my background is in psycholinguistics, I started to understand, and art, by the way, but that's a whole nother conversation. You can't write and draw at the same time. You can't speak and draw at the same time. So I realized when someone was in front of me and I was trying to help them understand a movement, that I needed to communicate directly with the part of their brain that was moving, not the part of their brain that was thinking whether Susie can or can't do what I'm asking them to do. And this took a decade of teaching and trial and error to really come up with this way of speaking and cueing that helped someone just move and experience what I was trying to teach them, it was so powerful for me. And I wanted to know if it was teachable. So I created a mastery program and found out it is teachable. I can teach people how to do this. And that preceded Core Spring. So wellness must precede fitness. So you must understand where someone's pain level is. And to your point, exactly, I had a client come in many years ago who had chronic back pain. She'd been in a terrible car crash. She went around from doctor to doctor talking about it. Ultimately, they said it's all in your mind. X-rays don't show anything. In your spine is fine. She actually survived the accident well. But when she came to me, and she was a social acquaintance, a friend, her pelvis was turned. I was working in a physical therapy clinic. I've worked in 4 physical therapy clinics that offer PT since the 90s, which was very fortunate because it was very rare at the time. Once her pelvis was in alignment, guess what? The pain went away. Not it went away, but it changed her life completely. She knew exactly what movements, like she was forbidden from sweeping or vacuuming because any twisting motion pushed her pelvis. So that took several years really to get her to stabilize in her pelvis. And once that happened, and she still does Pilates to this day. She lives in a different area, but her perception of her pain was denied by her doctors. She felt it in her spine. She felt it in her back, but it was really her misalignment of her pelvis. So my business as a Pilates teacher, if I didn't know it before that particular situation, my business was alignment. And that is true to this day. Because Pilates, because you're lying on the floor or a machine, most of the time is a way of creating alignment between the skull, spine, the pelvis, and then the ribs, the limbs, and all those fun muscles, the triceps, the biceps, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, rhomboids, they can all do their job to get us vertical and in less and less pain as life goes on, not more and more pain. And I'm living proof that it's possible. And I just can't stop talking about it, just like I've always felt about this work.
This episode is brought to you by the Patient Advocate Program. Are you tired of not having support between your rehab sessions? Introducing the Patient Advocate Program, and we're focused on your recovery, and we're offering you 24/7 access to a doctorate of physical therapy. Stop waiting in line to be seen and stop spending hours doing long exercise programs. Imagine being able to get all of your care delivered straight to your phone. Best of all, it's affordable. We believe everyone deserves top-notch relief without breaking the bank. So why wait? Take control of your health today and visit PTPatientAdvocate.com and book your free call with our experts.
Find, especially when it comes to the patients with low back pain and patients with sciatica, I agree. I notice a lot of alignment issues, but I also find, interestingly enough, a lot of what I like to call movement issues. So whenever I describe changing someone's movement, I call it like movement habits or movement behaviors or how they move. And it's kind of like when you are driving a car. And if you're driving a car, ideally it's important to us to stay within the lanes because it allows us to get to our destination the most efficiently. But if you have a tendency to actually turn your steering wheel in one direction and your tire is just rubbing the sidewalk for a long period of time, that's where things start to get really beaten up. And I think what's particularly interesting is that it's oftentimes like, if you're hitting the curb for one of two reasons. Number one, it's you actively steering yourself into the curb. So it's what we call the movement standpoint, or you either have some sort of mismanagement in your car's frame, you have a tire that is low on air. So if you take your hands off the steering wheel, your car is going to veer to the right. So that's what we call the alignment. And I think it is important for us to be able to address the two of them. And unfortunately, it's hard to, unfortunately for many practitioners and professionals, it's hard to combine the two. But it seems as if with your method and also in the Pilates world, we're looking at, okay, let's help restore the alignment. But what I do appreciate when it comes to mindful movement, and you said this earlier, I think it was like a Joe Pilates quote where it's like, you can't just do mindless exercise. And I think that might have actually been a huge societal shift because we went from being hunters and gatherers to being an industrialized nation to now we're in a modernized society where we are so sedentary. So all of a sudden our alignments are off just because we're not getting up and moving around more. The stresses that we deal with are very different than the stresses that we dealt with when we were hunters and gatherers. When we were hunters and gatherers, we had to run away from, the predators, the saber-toothed tigers and all those other things. And so in a way, our daily activities kind of fostered that optimal alignment, moving around. But all of a sudden, the majority of, here we are living in North America, the majority of Americans who are sitting on their couches, I'm guilty of that myself. I'm home the end of the day. I'm probably sitting in my couch 2 to 3 hours at night. But luckily for me, I'm a physical therapist, so I'm up on my feet all day. But if you're looking at a typical office worker, they're spending about 8+ hours sitting. Especially we live in a world where people are working on their laptops, so they're hunched forward, or people are working on multiple screens, so they're twisted to one side. What ends up happening is our alignment gets off because we're in these positions for a long period of time, but also we're so stressed, but we're stressed in a sedentary way. So when we exercise, and I'll say this is what I've observed, when the society exercises, we use it as a way to kind of escape the world. And when we use it to kind of escape the world, it ends up being more of kind of like a dissociative type of relationship where we kind of turn our brains off. And that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. When we're exercising, when we're doing things, we should be 100% focused on the task at hand. I didn't realize that. I thought that I didn't realize that was the case. Like when I was a college swimmer, so I was swimming, and everyone's like, Ashley, you must have been such a tough person, doing those long races. I was like, oh, I'm not tough at all. I was like, I felt every ounce of pain during that race. But for me, what I focused on was like, well, all right, well, this race really hurts, but how can I finish this race with the least amount of pain possible, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, instead of because some people would just be like, turn your brain off and go, it made me get even more into the activity that I was doing. This translates even nowadays. Like my main method of fitness now is powerlifting and jiu-jitsu. But the thing about jiu-jitsu is the fact that like you can't really think about anything else when someone's trying to choke you, right? And so when someone's trying to choke you, like you have to focus on the task at hand. And I think it is important. I really appreciate bringing those components up, of being able to like bring it all in, to be able to say like when you're doing your core springs session, right? You're in it. You're not thinking about anything else, and all your other world troubles go away. But here we are, focusing in the present.
Great points. I think what's interesting about Pilates is that when you are doing the Pilates exercises in the session, typically a private session begins with a lot of talk and catching up in the first 10 or 15 minutes, because the person is really unwinding a lot of tension and verbally, and they're processing. And then the session, and Mr. Pilates never worked with anybody more than 45 minutes, and there was no chit chat when he was working with you. And his sessions were 45 minutes long. So an actual session includes this kind of focus. One of the principles of Pilates is concentration. These exercises require your concentration. They require your total engagement, which is refreshing to your brain. It is refreshing to completely engage in those movements with minimal language. So all the verbal processing happens almost separate from the exercises. And I do think of Pilates as a Western martial art, in the sense that there are stages that you go through that tell you where you are in your practice, how advanced or beginner you are. And that's pretty much lost in the reformer Pilates world. And people say to me, how many types of Pilates are there? Which is kind of a funny question to me, because in the world of Pilates as I came up in and knew it to be and know it to be, that question seems silly, because we're all doing what Mr. Pilates recommended. And I'll just name a few that are for simplicity's sake for your listeners, so they understand what they're looking at and reading. Classical Pilates identifies a teacher who is trying to reproduce to a great extent what Mr. Pilates was doing. They don't use bands. They don't even really use balls. They just use the accessories that Mr. Pilates created and the machines that Mr. Pilates, they're similar to what he created. He was 5'8". So his machines are really not designed for larger people. It's very difficult for tall men to work on these kinds of machines. They make it work. I don't know. I was trained in that method because I wanted to know everything about Pilates. So I trained in so classical is often referred to as East Coast, because it happened in New York where Mr. Pilates was practicing. He came to the States from Germany in the 1920s and opened his studio there, as I mentioned earlier. But West Coast is more what we call contemporary. It used to be called West Coast, now it's called contemporary. And what's key about these two different methods of Pilates is that in the classical method, you will probably not hear the word neutral spine. The idea of a neutral spine, or a level relationship between the pubic bone and the two pelvic bones, the ASIS and the PS, is not discussed. And I've worked with teachers who teach this way, and I was fine, even with what I had going on. In West Coast, which is now called contemporary, we do specifically talk about the position of the pelvis, and we talk a lot about how to obtain this kind of alignment with the spine and just so you understand, it's the difference between taking your lumbar spine and pushing it into the mat and taking your lumbar spine and feeling a little mouse house underneath. That's a big distinction, at least when I was coming up, between East and West Coast, classical and contemporary. What's interesting is that in everything I've read about Mr. Pilates, he never makes that distinction. So I think that comes from the dancer community that was an early adapting community of his method. Because what are you going to do when you're a retired dancer? You're going to teach dance or you're going to work, you can teach Pilates. Then and contemporary embraces neoprene, balls, bands, free weights, all kinds of things on the mat and on the reformer. Then there's mat Pilates, which I thought was interesting that it is distinguished as a separate kind of Pilates. That is the mat foundation for Pilates. It is not separate in any way, but modern Pilates generally embraces balls and bands and other things that you can use on the mat. Classical Pilates is just pretty much the 34 exercises that Mr. Pilates created, maybe with a little floor ballet thrown in, depending on who you're working with. Then there's reformer Pilates, which is a very recent emerging kind of Pilates. Again, in the Pilates world, it's Pilates on the reformer. It's just one part of the method practiced on one of his apparatus. It is not separate, but it's become separate, and that happened probably about 10 years before COVID. Reformer classes started being offered, and within about 5 to 8 years before COVID, very reputable teacher training programs in Pilates that used to only offer comprehensive certification on all apparatus plus the mat started parsing it out, saying you can get trained in reformer and mat. You can get trained on the Cadillac, which is the trapeze table, 1-2 chair. So they all split up into separate trainings with a focus on reformer because that's what people wanted. Gyms wanted reformer classes. They needed reformer teachers. They didn't need a teacher that knew all these other things. And only one school that I know of, and I'm not saying there aren't others, Body Arts and Science International, which is my alma mater and my mentor, Ray Alasakowicz, he used to, probably still does, require that you get mat training in order to do his reformer training so that you have a basic understanding of how to teach someone how to use their own body weight in relationship to those machines and those springs. And I believe that that is really what's required if you're going to go through the transformation that the reformer can create. Reformer Pilates doesn't exist in the Pilates world, but it is a modern distinction because that's something that people are doing to the exclusion of all other forms of Pilates. So I'll give you that. And then but believe, I think that Pilates can be done anywhere. And I think that Mr. Pilates developed his mat program. And then he was interned as a prisoner of war during World War I in England. And he spent 5 years in this prison camp, working with people who were prisoners, working with wounded soldiers. He started to realize that certain people couldn't move. They had PTSD, they were amputees, they had injuries that prevented them from doing his method, but they could still learn how to breathe. And he devised ways of working with them with the springs and other things available to him. And that's when he conceived, I think, that his method could be done anywhere. That it was a method that could be applied to different kinds of movement with different tools, if you will, like the spring. So that's the evolution of Pilates. When he came back to Germany, he started developing that. And that's where the method was really born. So I'd say to my clients, you can do Pilates anywhere. And they come back and they say, gosh, your voice is in my head. I think there's some videos on YouTube or Instagram where they say, somebody's doing something. They're like, gosh, my Pilates teacher wouldn't agree with how I'm moving this thing. There is this thing, it gets into your brain. It gets into how you're using your body. Are you using it efficiently or are you not? So those are the distinctions that I can tell you now. And then you'll see different, like I talk about core spring being Pilates inspired, because it is. It's absolutely 100% Pilates inspired. Mr. Pilates never stopped innovating with spring apparatus until he was in his 80s. So Pilates would be something very different had he lived longer. There would be they actually discovered other apparatus that were sold in catalogs that people didn't even really know about. There was a completely separate business that he was doing from his studio business because he wanted people to practice Pilates at home and go out dancing and hiking and enjoy their lives. He never expected them to stay in a dark studio all day. So it is something that translates across, but in the mainstream, people need to understand the thing. I'm doing reformer Pilates. My only concern and question is, where's the transformation? How are they tracking their progress? How are they feeling it in their life? Because if it's not working in the room, it's not going to work in their life. Things should be changing in your life for the better, not just because you feel like you're in shape.
Absolutely. And, transformation all starts with the concept of taking action, right? And we spent, probably the past 30 minutes talking about the amazing principles and how the Pilates method can apply to improving pain and improving people's lives. But you also just discussed that there's so many options that are out there, right? There's Pilates studio in the town that I live in. There's 4 Pilates studios already, and I can't tell the difference between the two, right? All that I know is that the method is actually very useful when it comes to pain, getting back into being healthy, developing the wellness, and transitioning into the fitness aspect of it. So for the listeners out there who are thinking, all right, I know that I need to work on my alignment. I also know that I need to improve my movement ability. How does one get started into a Pilates routine? Walk us through some of the very simple steps that they can do to help them find a routine that could be useful for them. But then also, how can they gauge that what they're doing is actually particularly useful or helpful for them?
And is it Pilates? Because that's a legitimate question these days. Well, first and foremost, with regard to your platform, if someone has severe sciatica, they really do need a diagnosis and probably some rehabilitation before they embark on a Pilates program or any fitness program, because sciatica can be caused by so many variables. It could be a herniated disc in your back. One of the exercises that's really beneficial for sciatica is doing a pelvic tilt, where you're stretching and you're taking pressure off of the piriformis, this muscle that's deep in the buttocks that happens to sit right on top of your sciatic nerve. So in relieving your sciatica, you could be aggravating the injury in your spine. So you really do need to know what your diagnosis is, probably have some PT to understand, because Pilates is a post-rehabilitative modality in the modern world. Back when Joe was doing it, there wasn't a lot around. He could do rehab. He did all kinds of things. But for us, there's something called a scope of practice that a legitimate Pilates teacher or anybody in the fitness industry understands clearly. If someone hobbles into your space in extreme pain, you are not qualified without a diagnosis to understand what's going on with that person. It could be just piriformis syndrome, which is an inflammation of the piriformis muscle that presses on the nerve. It could be inflammation in the low back that has nothing to do with the herniated disc. So generally speaking, with sciatica, I'm very conservative, and the person you're talking to should be. So when you're going out, when you have this condition, for example, go to your doctor first. Figure out what's causing it. You'll probably get some relief from physical therapy, and then you can choose whatever you want. But if you do choose Pilates, you look at the website for the studio, and you see the background of the teachers, if it's there. You see the background of the owner, and you can determine sort of where a legitimate studio will tell you where they're trained and what they do. And you ask them. You go in, you schedule a 15-minute consultation. Most people do that to show you around and see what you need. In which case they'll say, if you're hobbling in here with excruciating pain, please go see your doctor before you do this, because this will be challenging in every way, I should say. So that's the first thing. Know what's going on with you so you have something to communicate. We're talking about communicating pain. If you have the information of why you have the symptoms of what you're feeling, and you're not just out of shape, but in pretty good shape in the sense that you don't have any real debilitating pain, but you're just out of condition, then you're still going to ask these questions. Where did the person train? Where did the teachers train? How long have they been practicing Pilates? Is what they practice Pilates? Or is it something else? Because there is a method out there called Legree by Sebastian Legree, and he uses a machine that looks like a Pilates machine. It's not Pilates. He even says on his Instagram, it's better than Pilates. Good for him. But I'm just saying, you have to ask these questions, because there's very little information out there for the consumer to ask. How long have you been trained? Are you still affiliated with the place that you trained? Is there some kind of continuing education that you do? Do you like your mentor? Do you still follow them? I mean, there are conversational ways to ask these questions without sounding like a lawyer with the, light shining down on someone. You're just trying to garner whether or not this person or this studio is going to help you with Pilates. Because Pilates you cannot know a thing about Pilates, and the exercises are going to help you. They're like a broken clock. They're going to tell the right time twice a day. You do them properly, you will get better, even if you never hear what I'm saying about Mr. Pilates and his background and all that stuff. But the only thing that I alluded to earlier, the only reason it's important to know that Mr. Pilates created his method as a form of rehab and conditioning is because that is what's built into those exercises. So working with Pilates teachers, even if they're just reformer Pilates teachers, they've been trained in Pilates, which means those exercises are going to be good for you. They're not going to hurt you, and you'll get conditioned. And I just taught at a local studio here, and I'm happy to know that that's what they do. It's a contemporary Pilates studio, but they are actually teaching Pilates, which made me very happy, because I would not want to go into a studio where people are not trained in that method, because the reason it's so popular is because it works. And just because it's become for reformer Pilates doesn't mean that has to change. So those are the questions that they can ask. They also need to ask if they have a beginner level classes, when they can expect to feel like they're ready to progress to the other classes, what to look for. That's a really good question to ask. It's often not communicated in the materials for these studios, but it's a good question for the person to ask, because then they'll start to know that the exercises that they're doing are progressive and do get more difficult, and they will get stronger, and they will get better. And that is mind and body. You'll feel better, and you will be able to make different choices about what you're going to do with your body and with your Pilates practice. But asking those questions about what to look for is helpful, because then the person walks in with something to understand that's going to progress them, so they're not just locking into endless class packages with no discernible way to progress.
Which then brings me to my last question. You've developed your own method and tools, like evolving or utilizing the principles from Pilates. So tell us a little bit more about core spring for the listeners who are like, I think I want to try out, or I want to hear a little bit more. What's the best way to get in touch or hear more?
Well, corespring.com. I'm just launching this website, so it's not fully populated. I don't even have a bio on there yet, but it's coming, along with some videos and other things that people can see, because that's what people want. Of course, I do too. CoreSpring, just so you know, is a very simple handheld device. It's a single spring apparatus with loops. So you hold it in your hands. You also hook it onto your feet. You work between your foot and your hand, your feet and your hands. And the point of CoreSpring is to experience the spring resistance moving through. So when we talk about core, and I will say that the Pilates world, because I came into it quite early in the 90s, is what really has established the word core. It was not discussed this way before Pilates came onto the scene. Core is a three-dimensional experience of the center of your body and how it relates to your pelvis and your shoulders, and of course the relationship of how you're standing, and the weight of your head, which is proportionally quite large. I think it's the largest in nature. CoreSpring named itself because when my patent partner and I were talking about, well, what are we going to call this thing? And like, well, it does the core, and you can feel the spring, and it was like CoreSpring. CoreSpring. It named itself. Because when you start to interact with it, and this is what got my attention right away, and why I decided not to share it as sort of, oh, look, this is a fun idea, and put it on Instagram. I thought, I've never seen this before. And I know what's going on in the Pilates world. I know what's going on in the fitness world because of my clients and my students. I mean, I stayed very connected, never seen it before. So I decided as soon as I put it in my hands that because I hadn't been an early adapter of other modalities, I taught ballet and Pilates and yoga together with a rock maple bar that was created by a lovely woman. This program doesn't exist anymore, but it was really great. I use Yamana body rolling for balls. So I'm not a stranger to bringing something into the Pilates lexicon, because I believe it can be practiced anywhere. I put this spring in my hands and I realized that it was very different. It was a very different sensation from using a bar. It was very different from using a band. It felt like, this is what the spring feels like. And my curiosity about these spring apparatus was answered. And it begged the question to me, how much of the spring resistance is actually lost into the machine or the wall when you feel it moving back and forth on a spiral? Literally, springs mimic a naturally occurring energy force, which is the spiral, the whirlwind, the whirlpool. So there is an energy exchange in the springs that is not lost when you're working directly with it. So we talk about direct spring resistance. I worked for about a year and a half with a naked spring, if you will, but I knew I wanted to do other things with it that were going to touch the body, and I have hair. My patent partner doesn't have hair, so he didn't understand why I needed to put a sleeve on it. I said, we need a sleeve. So I found a seamstress, a wonderful woman who still works with me to this day, put a sleeve on it, and created a lot of wellness protocols for the upper traps, releasing the head from the spine in very gentle stretches that you use with your arms, turning the head with this direct spring resistance, lengthening in opposite directions. It has a sense of like someone who knows your body is working with your body when you work with core spring this way. That's why that is a method. And if you understand these techniques, it's a safe, effective way to do it. It looks very humble. You'll see it on my website, corespring.com. But the spring was engineered I worked with a spring engineer to create a resistance that would not create torsion on the joints. This was very important. So combined with the method, you don't let it pull you around because it's quite powerful any more than you would let a spring go on a reformer or a machine and have it snap back in. Everybody understands. But a spring is never going to go from here to here like a band. So in some ways it's safer because it just goes to its shape and will fall. It only weighs about a pound and a few ounces. The loops were custom designed, and it took 2 or 3 years for me to really get the right softness so people could use it in their hands and not be distracted by it. Every aspect about it. A swivel so that it wouldn't, again, no torsion. This is about moving with the spring directly, working with your body. And the concepts of core spring are alignment for tone, breath for posture, core connection, and balance and motion. And those are the 4 themes around which my weekly classes are developed. I teach 3 live classes, and I've developed a custom app that's going to go live hopefully by the end of this month. I got a little bit slowed down by the fires here in Southern California. I survived it. I was evacuated but didn't lose anything, so I'm very lucky. But it did sort of take out this chunk of time when I was going to be filming, and I've had to do a lot of things. But when you purchase a core spring, you get the core spring, you get a custom backpack in which you can carry it. You get 2 extra extenders to accommodate people up to 6'2". And if you're under 5'3", you need to order a custom spring, and you can find out information about that on my website. And you also get a 7-day challenge or a 7-part challenge, because the core spring kit includes a booklet. And so I take you through how to use the core spring for the things that are in the booklet, plus a few other goodies and bonuses that are in there, so that you can get started for the wellness part. Wellness must precede fitness. You must be as pain-free as possible before you embark on a fitness program so that you can benefit and excel immediately. One of the things that I think because Pilates did so much for me so quickly, that I want people to get results right away. I want them to have an immediate impact, visible, perceptible, subjective, objective improvement right away that is sustainable by practicing those same movements. So core spring expresses that I've been doing for 25 years in Pilates, that expresses this need for people to come in, feel better, look better, have a perception that something has changed, and that it's possible to continue to strengthen around that improvement with those tools. So that's what core spring expresses, and that's how I try to give people this way to do it. And I'm starting a live Q&A in the second quarter of this year, where I'll be doing a monthly question and answer. So people, no matter where they are, they've never done core spring, they just have questions about it, or they have done, or they're somewhere in their challenge, their 7-day challenge, that they can come in and ask questions about core spring, because it is new. And I understand that I want people to recommend it, but it has to get some traction in the world and have enough social proof and testimonial that people like you can say, just like you would say to somebody, please do Pilates, you'd say, you got to try core spring. It can't hurt you. It's going to help you.
Great. Yeah. I'm excited for the growth and how many people it can help, or the amount of people it can help. And so listeners, if you didn't got a chance to write that down, I'm actually going to be putting the link to corespring.com in the show notes. Charlene, this has been really insightful and really helpful, and I'm really excited for the company, and I'm excited for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And what I can do is offer your listeners a 25% discount off the retail price for core spring with the code IFIXSciatica. Does that work for you?
That sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the show notes. Listeners.
Put those in the show notes, and thank you so much.
Listeners, check out the show notes, check out core spring, and Charlene, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. Best of luck. Wonderful platform.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you got some help from today's podcast. And for more info, check us out at ifixyoursciatica.com. Have a fantastic and pain-free day. No patient-therapist relationship is formed by listening to this podcast. We are not providing medical advice, and all information should be confirmed by a medical provider.